If your patients are telling you they've stopped eating spinach and berries because they've heard these foods are secretly poisoning them, then they've probably stumbled across the controversial book Toxic Superfoods by Sally Norton. This book and its alarming claims about oxalates poisoning us caught my attention. But since I am not a kidney stone expert, I knew I needed backup. So I called in the smartest kidney stone dietitian I know, Melanie Betz, to help me understand this book's claims. I'm Colleen, a PA, dietitian, and your nutrition mentor. Welcome to the Exam Room Nutrition Podcast, your guide to giving better nutrition advice. Melanie did an in-depth investigation into the claims made in Sally's controversial bestseller. She separated facts from fiction and broke down the science, or lack thereof, behind these alarming messages. So today, we'll uncover whether there's ever a valid reason for patients to limit oxalate intake, who actually needs to limit dietary oxalates and who doesn't, what real risks come with the extreme dietary recommendations from this book, the misinformation tactics this book uses and how it can mislead patients and healthcare providers. Plus, at the end, I'll share simple ways to spot misinformation online. And don't worry, if you aren't a kidney stone expert, there's so much you can learn in this episode. You'll feel empowered to confidently tackle misinformation, avoid unnecessary dietary restrictions, and provide clear, evidence-based nutrition guidance your patients can actually trust. So get comfy and enjoy my conversation with Melanie. Melanie, I am so excited to have you back on the podcast. You are one of very few repeat guests on my show. So thank you so much for agreeing to come in and talking about this really interesting topic. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Colleen, so much for having me again. I am honored to be here.
Like we were talking off air, I've never done one of these kind of more controversial myth-busting episodes, and I'm thrilled that my first one is with you. You are the kidney stone expert, so I cannot wait to unpack this book and a lot of the issues that you had with it. And so before we really get into the meat of kind of what the book claimed, I think it's really important if you could explain exactly what oxalates are and how the body processes them.
Yeah, absolutely. So oxalates are simply an organic compound that occur in pretty much every single plant food that you can think of in some amount, right? So you'll find oxalate in essentially every single vegetable, every single fruit, whole grains, nuts, beans, seeds. Oxalate just occurs in plants. I actually relatively recently at a conference listened to a talk from a plant biologist and learned a lot more about sort of the role in oxalate in plant metabolism, which was fascinating. And long story short is they are a defense mechanism for the plant. So they basically help keep predators away and help the plant survive. And so that is what oxalate is. That's why it exists and why it is in healthy plant foods. And when we consume it, there's really no use for it. Our body, like many things in our foods, like there's no benefit to it. And so in varying degrees, and we'll probably talk about it later, our bodies absorb a small amount of the oxalate that we eat into our bodies. They sort of float around our bodies in our blood, get processed by the liver, and eventually get excreted in our urine, where they are most known, obviously, for their role in kidney stone formation.
So helpful. I'm just curious if you could clear the air. Is it an appropriate thing for clinicians to give patients a high oxalate, low oxalate list of foods that they should avoid? Is that appropriate or not?
Yeah, so very contrary to everything that we are going to talk about today, the old school way of thought of treating or preventing kidney stones was a low oxalate diet. However, that way of going about it is very much falling out of favor because we understand a whole lot more about all the benefits of foods that happen to be higher in oxalate for, ironically, kidney stone prevention. So I say no, a strict low oxalate diet is never appropriate in any situation, and we'll talk more about that later. But typically we want to talk a lot more about getting in more kidney stone inhibitors, more calcium, more potassium, more phytate, more magnesium, all these good things that truly come in the exact same foods that happen to have oxalate in them.
Are there any specific circumstances where patients should truly limit their oxalate intake? Because the book kind of gives tons and tons of medical conditions that people should lower their oxalate intake. But I'm curious, in your opinion, what exact circumstances and which patients maybe should be following a low oxalate diet?
Yeah. So I think that there is never a time when someone should follow a true low oxalate diet that attempts to restrict oxalate to, say, a certain amount of oxalate per day. It's actually impossible to accurately know how much oxalate you're consuming for a wide variety of reasons. And so I think no one should be on a strict low oxalate diet. That being said, I think there are times when maybe limiting the extremely high foods of oxalate does make sense. The two groups of people that come to mind are patients who have had gastric bypass surgery or ileostomies or some sort of fat malabsorption like short gut or something like that. If they're forming stones because of high urine oxalate, like we cannot assume that someone who has kidney stones and who has had gastric bypass surgery is forming stones because of oxalate. We need a 24-hour urine test to know that because there's other contributing factors potentially. But in those situations, I think that, not having a ton of spinach certainly makes sense, but limiting sort of those maybe 5 highest oxalate foods, spinach, almonds, beets, Swiss chard, and navy beans, like that, like limiting those very few foods is very, very different than a true low oxalate diet, which is going to make it virtually impossible for someone to consume enough fiber, enough fruits and vegetables, whole grains. Like all of our healthy foods that we generally want patients to be consuming are going to be completely off the table or very severely limited. And so I think, again, limiting those very high oxalate foods for some situations, but a true low oxalate diet, I would argue, is never appropriate.
For those of you who are wanting more about kidney stone prevention and really getting into those details, go back after this episode and listen to episode 9, which is her first debut on my podcast, called Kidney Stone Prevention, What Every Clinician Should Know. And she goes into detail about oxalates and the 24-hour urine test and all of those details. So go and check that episode out after this one. I'll link to it in the show notes. Okay, so let's unpack exactly what specific diet this book recommends, and then just curious your thoughts on some of those potential risks of following it.
Yeah. So the book generally is recommending a low oxalate diet. And as I mentioned earlier, oxalate is found in literally every single plant food. All fruits, all vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, beans, legumes, tofu, like literally everything. And so it's not like she's recommending a low carb or like sort of a diet that we're aware of. It truly is just recommending that people limit oxalate. I don't believe that she ever gives a specific amount, but basically as low as possible. So as I mentioned, if we are limiting oxalate as much as possible, we're going to be limiting plant foods essentially as much as possible, which will lead people to be consuming a lot more animal foods. Now, there's nothing wrong with chicken. There's nothing wrong with beef or fish or cheese or milk, right? I'm actually a fan of all of those foods. But the problem is that when we take away a whole group of foods or severely limit that whole group of foods, people are going to be consuming a lot more of the foods that are safe and are oxalate free, which are all animal foods, like all meat, eggs, dairy is all going to be oxalate free because they're not from plants essentially. And so I have huge issues with potentially having a very large protein load, restricting fiber, and all of the health issues that we have with that, higher risk of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, kidney disease, ironically, as well as like not getting in enough fiber is not going to be great for your gut, right? So we think about just like all the benefits of fruits and vegetables that we know so well, as I'll probably talk about later, are just gone because you're so limited in the plant foods that you're able to eat on a strict low oxalate diet.
Does she specifically say that patients should follow like the carnivore diet or keto diet? Does she call out any other dietary patterns, or is it specifically just a low oxalate diet?
She does not. And in fact, she does talk about how the liver can make oxalate from certain groups of foods. She doesn't talk about it as much as it's warranted, because when we look at the amount of oxalate that's in your urine, really the amount of oxalate that you eat only accounts for a maximum of 50% of the oxalate. For many people, it's like 20 or 30%. So the amount of oxalate that your liver is producing, because your liver does produce a large amount of oxalate every day, a large percentage, up to 80% of the oxalate in your urine is coming from your liver. And your liver makes oxalate from amino acids. So that's protein. So even, if you were eating zero oxalate, you were eating a fully carnivore diet, you would still actually probably have pretty high urine oxalate because you would be encouraging your liver to make all of that oxalate from that amino acid. So she certainly doesn't recommend a carnivore diet because she acknowledges that the liver can make oxalate from some of these other foods. So really it's just avoiding this toxic oxalate is really the premise.
And in her book, does she give a list of foods of like, don't eat these foods kind of summary, or does she just kind of leave it to the reader to figure that out?
So she definitely has a very extensive list of foods and provides references that she feels that we should follow in terms of foods to limit and consume. She claims is the gold standard and is 100% accurate. It may or may not be. I would argue it doesn't really matter because the amount of oxalate in foods varies drastically, like all nutrients, but especially oxalate is very, very susceptible to weather changes, soil changes, ripeness of the food, up to like 60% difference. So like you really like even an apple is not just an apple, right? There's so many different things that go into how much oxalate specifically is going to be in that apple.
Now, she also has a really long list of symptoms and conditions that she attributes to oxalates. And so I'm curious if you could just kind of give us a few of those and if there is any scientific evidence that supports these claims.
So I cannot even begin to list the things that Sally says like excess oxalate can cause. It literally ranges every single organ in your entire body. Things, the obvious things, kidney stones, joint pain, but even says things like brain fog. Like, what does that even mean, right? I think we all have brain fog. Mood problems, she says. So things like depression, anxiety, lack of pep, whatever that means, chronic itching, itchy eyes, eye floaters, urination issues, cloudy urine, UTIs, shortness of breath, yeast infections, cold hands and feet, bone fractures, irritable bowel syndrome, excessive belching, like literally anything in the world, any time you maybe didn't feel 100%, you could find in Toxic Superfoods that it could be attributed to oxalate, which I know we'll talk about later is really part of her goal. Like she wants you to be afraid of oxalate so that basically she makes it impossible that you couldn't potentially have an oxalate problem because every single health issue that's or ailment or sort of feeling icky could potentially be related to oxalate. Of course, you need to rely on her for your health, right? So
Yeah.
It's pretty impressive. If you go check out the blog post, I list a pretty extensive list of all the things she says that oxalate is related to. And to answer your question, no, there's actually not a shred of evidence that a low oxalate diet improves any health condition, period, including kidney stones. None, zero, because of reasons that we talked about, right? When we cut out healthy foods, that has health consequences. And so there's literally not a shred of evidence ever that cutting out oxalate in humans will improve health in any situation.
And, I'd argue further that if you cut out all those foods, like you had mentioned, they're great sources of fiber, phytochemicals, antioxidants. Now we're increasing probably our risk of other things like potentially cancer, constipation, elevated cholesterol, all of the things that fiber combats. So, so interesting, her perspective on this. And I want to dig in a little bit into some of the research because I thought this was fascinating that you mentioned that it misrepresents study results and then will apply them inappropriately to humans. So can you share a few examples of this?
Yeah. So that is what the entire book is. And I think that's what makes misinformation like this so dangerous, because to someone who doesn't understand science, which is most of us, right? Most of us do not have some science degree. It makes it seem legit, right? It's like there's like thousands of studies, hundreds of maybe thousands of studies referenced in the back of the book. And you think, man, like she really did her research. Like this must be true. But when you actually go in and look at what the studies say and what she says that they're saying, it's two completely different things. For example, she does a lot of animal studies, and these are typically very extreme animal studies, and oftentimes from like the 50s and 60s. So she talks a lot about this study where apparently there was a group of sheep that were consuming only incredibly high oxalate foods, only incredibly high oxalate foods. So that would be like saying like, hey, human, only go eat spinach and nothing else. And obviously human metabolism is a whole lot more complicated than that, right? Like there's huge impacts of the calcium that we consume along with any oxalate. And obviously no one is consuming just spinach. No dietitian in the entire world is saying we should consume just spinach or any single food. Like that is insane. So she takes this study in sheep who were consuming only some super, super high oxalate grain and said that they had slower growth. And then she talks all about how that's so bad for us because it's toxic to sheep. In chapter 2, I think, or pretty near the beginning of the book, there's quite a bit of information about honeybee larvae and how oxalate is so toxic to honeybee larvae. Okay, well, humans are not honeybee larvae. And I think that is a very consistent pattern in the book, taking data even from like rat studies in a scientific setting, right? And that is a very dangerous move because humans are not rats or honeybee larvae, right? Like we have different enzymes. Our bodies react differently. We have very different diets than rats. We have different metabolism. We have different digestion. Like we are very, very different. Not saying that rat studies aren't important. certainly animal studies are critical for our understanding of how the body works and different mechanisms and these types of things. But to take data from rats, sheep, and honeybee larvae and then apply them to humans without any human trials to back that up is incredibly dangerous. So that is one definitely big theme that she does over and over and over again. Another thing is taking studies in a very, very specific population with altered, with the pathophysiology, and then saying, oh, this is why like the general population shouldn't be consuming oxalate. She says that kidney researchers recommend like 150 to 200 milligrams of oxalate per day and gives a citation. However, this is not a recommendation from like an actual organization. This is just like kind of a one-off paper. And she cites many other papers who actually recommend exactly what I talked about earlier in terms of just limiting those super duper high oxalate foods. So she takes this paper and says, oh, kidney researchers recommend we only consume this much oxalate. But that was also a paper for about patients who have an ileostomy. And patients who have ileostomies or any sort of fat malabsorption have a wildly different metabolism and digestion of oxalate than your average person who has a intact gut. She also takes a lot of data from papers from people who have a very rare genetic condition called primary hyperoxaluria. And she says like, oh, this is what we should be doing. And that's just simply not what that paper is saying, right? That's not a recommendation for the general population because those people have highly altered pathophysiology, right? And another thing is that she completely ignores conflicting data. Like there is obviously thousands of studies that show that when you eat more fruits and vegetables, which inevitably are going to have oxalate in them, good things happen. When we eat fruits and vegetables, we have improved health in essentially every single health condition that's ever existed. Of course, she doesn't mention any of that. And so I could go on and on, but like those are kind of the big themes that I saw again and again in the book.
I'm thinking about my vegan patients who are on a strict plant-based diet, whether for religious reasons, by choice, by health, who cares? Was there any point in her book where she did look into how many of those patients, or maybe is there any research on how many vegan or vegetarian patients actually get kidney stones because of oxalate? Is there anything that actually proves that correlation?
None that I'm aware of. Okay.
And she didn't bring that up, like the actual dangers of, consuming a lot of fruits and veggies.
No, I don't think that there's any data that shows a higher rate of kidney stones in vegetarians or vegans. To be fair, I don't know if there's any data that's looked into that specifically, but there is a lot of data that shows that people who consume both a DASH and Mediterranean style diet, which are not vegetarian or vegan, but definitely promote a lot of very higher oxalate foods, right? Fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, especially the DASH diet. Those are consistently associated with a much lower risk of stones, up to 60% lower risk of stones following these very plant-heavy dietary patterns. So she obviously doesn't talk much about that.
Yeah, I wonder why. Okay. So can you explain what anecdotal evidence is and exactly how the author uses it to support her claims? Because I think this is important.
Yeah. And I feel like this is a very common tactic used in the wellness space, right? Even like for toxic superfoods and oxalate and kind of everything and all the misinformation out there. So anecdotal evidence is essentially just saying like, oh, this worked for my friend, so it's going to work for me. It worked for me, it's going to work for you, right? So giving this one instance and saying then we should do it. And there are so many issues with that. If I can kind of break it down into two big issues. Issue one is that we are all different, right? So even if it did work for you, we have no idea if it's going to work for someone else. I'll use kidney stones as an example because that's what I'm most familiar with. So say someone followed a low oxalate diet and they didn't get any more stones. Okay, well, maybe you were forming stones because you had high urine oxalate, but the other person doesn't have high urine oxalate and they're forming kidney stones because of a whole host of other reasons. Maybe they also have other health conditions that are going to be worsened by that low oxalate diet that you don't have. There's just like so many different things that could go into the right diet that's going to work for you. That saying that this work for you and is going to work for you, it's just like, it just doesn't make any sense. And that is exactly what research answers, right? Like we, through research methods, control for all of that noise so we can know exactly who an intervention is going to work for. And then I think the other big issue with anecdotal evidence is that you have no idea exactly which change resulted in fewer stones or whatever health outcome you're talking about, right? So yes, you started eating less oxalate, but maybe that also means that you started drinking more milk, or maybe that also means that you were more aware of your health and so you started exercising more, or maybe you felt really, really good because you felt that you finally had control over your health and that had reduction on stress and that had an improved outcome, right? There's so many different things that go in to what actually caused that improvement in health. And that again is what research answers for us. Like, we know we can control for these things and have just that one change. So we do know, in fact, that that one change resulted in that health outcome. But when you're just one person and you say, okay, I started following a low oxalate diet and I didn't get any more kidney stones. Well, okay, is that going to work for everyone? Is it really the lower oxalate that resulted in that improved health? Or were you maybe not even going to form stones anyway? Like, maybe you just were a one-time stone former and like you're not going to form stones anymore. And those are the exact questions that research answers for us.
Awesome. I'm curious, is this her personal story? Did she have stones and like
Yes.
cured herself with this diet?
Not stones that I'm aware of. No, she had all the symptoms in the world, felt miserable. She eventually apparently had pseudo gout, which is related to per Sally chronic inflammation. And it was ultimately because she was eating all of these superfoods, which is why she had gout. Ironically, gout is improved by consuming more fruits and vegetables, but that's
Uh-oh.
but I don't know.
No.
I don't know what I'm talking about, right?
No, we'll just leave that one right there. Yeah, and you're so right. Influencers, especially in the wellness space, really do use the personal journey, their story of healing as kind of the end all be all. This is the answer for everyone. And it's just so inaccurate. And like you said, our bodies are different. Nutrition science is complex. Biology is complex. Chemistry is complex. And what might work for one person may not work for the next. And I think that's why nutrition is difficult and why I always recommend working with a registered dietitian who can take that research and what we know, but apply it to the patient sitting in front of them. Now, I love how you break down how the author tries to erode trust in health experts. And this is rampant right now on social media. There is just a crumbling of the trust and respect of higher education and medical professionals. And so, can you just explain the three major themes that you noticed throughout this book?
Yeah. I just want to kind of highlight what you just said about how rampant these strategies are. Unfortunately, even the highest levels of our government currently, like, these are the exact same strategies that are being used to discredit people who actually know what they're talking about. So you are left feeling like there's no one left to trust but this wellness influencer, right? Which is exactly what they want to do, because then they can sell you, a $600 supplement or whatever it is, right? And it's scary and heartbreaking, honestly, because people are desperate and need help, and wellness influencers are truly causing harm because they're pushing people away from the people who are actually going to be able to help them. So the three major themes is, number one, skepticism of scientific guidelines. So Sally talks a ton about how all these different healthcare agencies, including like the American Heart Association and the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, we recommend as healthcare professionals that people eat fruits and vegetables. Surprise, surprise.
Yes.
We recommend that people eat beans and nuts and seeds and plant proteins, all these foods that happen to be higher in oxalate. And then she says that, and then right after that she says, but look, everyone's getting more diabetes. We have more obesity. We have more heart disease, right? We're sicker than ever. So clearly it's the fruits and vegetables in these scientific guidelines that is making people sick. Well, let's think. Are people consuming more fruits and vegetables? No. No. But I believe that the average fruit and vegetable consumption in the United States is around 2 servings a day. The minimum recommended, depending on who you ask, is about 5 servings a day. People are not consuming fruits and vegetables. We are not consuming a lot of oxalate. And so to say like, oh, it's because these health experts that don't know what they're talking about, they're recommending we eat fruits and vegetables, but we're sicker than ever. Well, people aren't doing what we recommend, which is a whole other conversation. But we certainly cannot say it's the fruits and vegetables that are making people sick in this argument. She also pulls on your heartstrings quite a bit and monopolizes on our very broken healthcare system. I don't think anyone in the world is going to say that our healthcare system is stellar in the United States. It has all sorts of issues. And I'm sure every single person listening has some story about when they went to see a doctor or dietitian or whomever, and they felt dismissed and unheard and didn't get the care that they deserved. That is an issue, certainly. But that is an issue because we have a broken insurance system and all these other issues. She claims that it's because we don't know about oxalate, and so we're not able to help people. Like, I know that the audience is mostly healthcare professionals, so you know what's broken about the healthcare system.
Right.
It's not that we're hiding oxalate poisoning. Like, that's definitely not why you don't feel heard. Which kind of feeds right into my next point, is that she very often suggests that we are hiding things. She will quote medical conventions from like 1850 and say, oh, this doctor said that like oxalate is the poison. Like and her argument is like, oh, well, we've known about this since 1850. Why don't we know about it now? Well, maybe we've learned something since 1850. I don't know. Like a little bit of data has come out. Like we understand things a little better. Plus, that was one doctor, one random person in 1850. Like I'm sure you can find doctors in 2025 telling people to not eat vegetables, but that is not what we know is going to be beneficial for health. She often will say that all of this data that she's sharing is like a secret knowledge pool that like she knows and like healthcare professionals don't know. No, we all have access to the exact same scientific guidelines, the exact same like research systems, PubMed and Google, and like right, all of the ways that we go about finding peer-reviewed journal articles. And those scientific guidelines, if you've never had the privilege of being involved in writing like practice recommendations, it is an insane process, right? Like it takes years of many experts poring over all the available data. And like that data that she's talking about is included in those searches. Like it's not like we're just ignoring all of this stuff as she implies. Like we look at all of it, but we know that we have to look at it critically and look at what actually happens in humans when you eat certain foods, which is a good thing, ironically, when you eat higher oxalate foods that happen to have other benefits for you.
I think we could do an entire episode on kind of the claims against healthcare professionals and why they believe that we're all, being paid by big food and, big pharma supports us. And it's just honestly, when you're a healthcare professional, that's comical because I talk to any dietitian. I bet you all of them would be like, yeah, that'd be awesome if I was being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, that'd be great.
That'd be great. Dietitians are one of the lowest paid healthcare professionals. And it's the influencers who are some of the highest paid healthcare professionals. I use that very loosely.
Wellness professional. Yeah.
Yeah. Wellness. Thank you. Wellness professionals. And it's just so crazy and mind boggling to think that we're paid off to say these certain claims because these certain brands and companies have paid us. And it's just ridiculous. And like you had said, if you actually look into what goes into creating these practice guidelines, it's an exhaustive program that encapsulates a lot of different fields. You've got dietitians, you've got doctors, you've got PhDs in nutrition science. There's so many different brilliant minds come together collectively to look at the research to create the guidelines that would benefit the majority of Americans. Would you agree with what I'm saying here?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I want to highlight what we said earlier. The reason that they do this is so that you have to rely on them. So you have to buy their product. You have to work with them because they don't want people coming in and saying, hey, like your stuff is bogus, because they know their stuff is bogus and they know that there's no evidence to back it up. And in this case, there's a lot of evidence to show the exact opposite point. And so that is why they do that, because they need you desperate. So you have to buy their products.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're positioned perfectly to be like, oh, this is causing all these problems, but looky here.
I happen to have the magic solution.
I sure do. Let's close it out and kind of bring this around full circle. If my listener has patients who've had kidney stones and maybe they've read the book or they've seen something online and they are coming and asking, hey, I read that I need to follow a low oxalate diet to prevent kidney stones. Do I? And how do we answer that patient? And if you disagree, which I think you do, what are some other quick practical tips or other strategies that we should be encouraging our patients to follow?
Yeah. So point number one, whenever we are talking anything kidney stone prevention, is we need to have a 24-hour urine test. I'm sure I talked all about that in my previous episode, so definitely go check that out. But without a 24-hour urine test, we have no idea why someone's forming kidney stones. Only about 20% of people forming calcium oxalate kidney stones have elevated oxalate in the first place. And so I think it is crucial for both you and the patient to get that urine test, and for you to not assume that they're forming stones because of oxalate, because that is what unfortunately typically happens. But once you get that test, you are able to identify what is actually causing those stones. And it's also really powerful for the patient to see, oh, my urine oxalate is totally fine. Like there must be other things that's going on. Typically, it's high urine calcium, and we can get that down via not consuming a lot of non-dairy animal protein, not consuming too much salt, and some other things. So getting that urine test is always, always, always critical. Instead of focusing on restricting dietary oxalate, which inevitably is going to result in lower fiber, lower plant food consumption, it is impossible to follow a low oxalate diet and not. Instead, we want to focus on reducing the bioavailability of oxalate that we do consume, as well as making sure that we're getting in enough of those kidney stone inhibitors. So for reducing the bioavailability, the number one thing that we can do is making sure that we're eating enough calcium from foods, because calcium and oxalate love to bind. And if we consume enough calcium with our healthy diets that contain oxalate, that calcium and oxalate are going to bind in our gut, and we just excrete it in our feces, as opposed to that oxalate getting absorbed. So the amount of getting in enough calcium has a huge impact on how much oxalate actually ends up getting absorbed into our bodies anyway. And those kidney stone inhibitors, I could talk for hours, but long story short, plant foods are going to have all of the things in them that help inhibit kidney stones, which is likely why we do see consistently in study after study, people who consume that DASH diet or Mediterranean style diet tend to have fewer stones despite the higher oxalate in it, because it's packed with things like potassium and magnesium and alkali precursors and something called phytate and like tons of other beneficial things. So that's as nutshell as I could get at the end.
No, that's so good. It's so helpful. And you're such a breath of fresh air. And so if you guys do work with patients who've had kidney stones, either in primary care or you do work in nephrology, then I would 100% encourage you to guide your patients to Melanie's website. She's got great blogs. She's got her own podcast. And it's a great resource, especially if you are a PA and you don't have time to go into the nitty gritty, or maybe you don't know as much as Melanie, which shocker, a lot of us don't, then go and check out her page. So Melanie, can you share where people can find you and connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me on Instagram at The Kidney Dietitian, and also on Facebook. My website is a great place for patients to go because there's tons of blogs and recipes. And then they can also find all my other resources like cookbooks and courses and that sort of thing. And my website is thekidneydietitian.org. And my podcast is called the Eat Away Kidney Stones Podcast, if you want to check that out on all major podcast platforms.
You are a wealth of information. I learn so much from you every time. So thank you for coming on again. Thank you for debunking this book because it's needed and we need more voices on social media like you. So thank you so much for the gift of your time today, Melanie.
Oh, thank you so much, Colleen, for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right, now it's time for my nutrition notes. Hopefully now you've got some tools to spot misinformation when something sounds too good to be true. Remember, nutrition misinformation isn't just annoying. It can lead your patients down paths that compromise their health and your best clinical efforts. As medical professionals, our job isn't just to give advice. It's to empower our patients to navigate the noisy world of nutrition misinformation. So before your patients swap out their spinach smoothies for steak breakfasts because of something they saw online, let's arm them and ourselves with some critical thinking tools. So when looking at nutrition information online, here are a few tips to avoid misinformation. First, look for credentials. Qualified professionals like RDs and those with nutrition-focused PhDs will use balanced language. They'll never use fear-based clickbait. Also, instruct your patients to watch out for red flags. If someone is demonizing entire food groups without solid evidence, or they're offering supplements as the only answer, that is a sign to pause and question. Another tactic of influencers is to use terms like toxic, inflammatory, and glucose spikes to create unnecessary fear around food, which then perfectly positions their product as the solution. Professionals you can trust will explain concepts clearly and avoid alarmist language. They'll prioritize balanced, research-backed explanations. You can teach your patients to spot the cherry picking of research as well. So even if someone says research shows, be very skeptical. Nutrition studies are complex and they can be manipulated to fit a narrative. Reliable experts reference scholarly sources, they'll acknowledge research limitations and consider the full body of evidence rather than selectively citing convenient studies. And finally, remind your patients and yourself that good nutrition isn't about fear or extremes. It's personalized, flexible, and evidence-based. Now, if this episode was helpful, share it with a colleague who is also tired of fighting online misinformation. I'd love to support each other on social media, so shoot me a DM on Instagram or LinkedIn at Exam Room Nutrition. And together, let's continue to make our patients healthier, one exam room at a time. I'll see you next week.